My daughter-in-law's text lit up my phone just as I pulled into the church parking lot, the gift bag rustling on the passenger seat beside me. "Just stay in the car, Mom. I'll come get the gift." For a moment, I thought I'd misread it, the way I sometimes misread the tiny print on my utility bills. But the words sat there, clear as day, while I watched a group of laughing women walk through the double glass doors, balloons bouncing above their heads. The radio was turned low, some old Motown song humming quietly, and I cut the engine. The sudden silence felt louder than the music had. I looked up and saw Megan, my daughter-in-law, step out of her silver SUV. She was glowing, one hand on her belly, the other adjusting the sash that said "Mama-to-be" across her chest. Next to her, my son Daniel carried a stack of white favor boxes. They didn't see me at first. Why would they? I was parked 2 rows out, where the older folks usually park, close to the exit. Another buzz. "It's just easier if you don't come in. Okay? It's more of a friends thing. I'll bring you a plate later." I stared at the screen so long that it dimmed and went black. My name is Irene. I'm 67 years old, and I've spent most of my life going in when people needed me. Into hospital rooms at 3 in the morning for double shifts. Into Daniel's school when he forgot to mention a parent conference. Into bank lobbies clutching thick envelopes, trying to keep a roof over our heads after my husband died. The first time I held Daniel, the nurse laid him in my arms under those harsh fluorescent lights that make everyone look a little washed out. He had a full head of dark hair like his father, and a temper like mine. We left the hospital with a plastic bracelet, a stack of crinkled discharge papers, and a bill that made my eyes water. I remember sitting at the kitchen table late at night with a cup of instant coffee. His father's pay stubs spread out beside the hospital invoice, trying to make numbers I didn't have stretch into spaces they wouldn't fill. When my husband, Frank, had his heart attack at 52, it was a Tuesday. I remember because the electric bill was due on Wednesday. The envelope was already stamped and ready on the counter. In the weeks after the funeral, the mail kept coming, condolence cards mixed in with statements that began with, "We regret to inform you that your payment is past due." I bought a cheap accordion file at the dollar store, the kind with the little paper tabs, and labeled it with his name. Insurance, mortgage, auto loan, utilities. It made me feel less helpless, putting each problem into its own compartment. I learned to read contracts the way other women my age learned to crochet. I knew what fixed rate really meant, and how to spot the line that would turn a favor into a trap. For years, that file lived on the second shelf of my hall closet, right next to the winter blankets. Every page in it was paid, in full, by the time Daniel graduated high school. He was my pride. I still keep his high school diploma in a frame on my bedroom dresser, the glass wiped clean every time I dust. When he called me from college to say he was switching majors from engineering to business, I told him I was proud of him anyway. When he called to say he'd met someone, a sweet girl named Megan from accounting class, I smiled into the receiver and underlined food on my grocery list. I knew they would come home hungry. They married in a small ceremony at the same church whose parking lot I was now sitting in. We ate vanilla cake from paper plates. I still have the receipt for the catering, folded carefully into the pocket of my old checkbook. The ink faded, but legible. My contribution wasn't grand, but it was everything I could manage. I paid the final installment in cash, counting the bills twice before handing them over, the way I always do. A few years later, when they wanted to buy their first home, they sat at my kitchen table with glossy printouts from real estate websites. Daniel's face had that hopeful, height look I recognized from when he was a boy asking for something he knew was too much. The bank wanted a bigger down payment. Megan stared at the numbers on her phone, chewing the inside of her cheek. I watched them and thought of that old accordion file and the quiet power of paid-off debts. I cashed out a small retirement account I'd been nursing for years. The banker, a young woman who called me ma'am a little too loudly, slid a form across the desk. "This will reduce your retirement income, Mrs. Walker," she said. I signed anyway. The pen felt heavier than it looked. Daniel hugged me so hard my glasses slipped crooked. Megan's eyes shone as she said, "We'll pay you back, Mom, I swear. You'll have a room in our house for when we have kids. You'll never be lonely." I folded the receipt into my purse, right next to my folded grocery list. The months turned into years. I drove over with pots of soup whenever one of them had a cold. I watched their dog when they traveled. When Megan's mother retired to Florida, I became the stand-in for holidays, for birthdays, for small crises like leaky faucets and misplaced tax forms. I never minded. Being needed is its own kind of warmth. Then came the fertility treatments. They talked in hushed voices about appointments, tested schedules, credit cards maxed for the sake of a dream. One evening, Daniel sat at my kitchen table again, only this time there was no hopeful grin. Just a stack of paperwork from the clinic. He had highlighted the balance they still owed, the yellow stripe like a warning. "I hate to ask, Mom," he said, rubbing his forehead, "but they won't even schedule the next round if we don't pay this." The amount made my fingers go cold. I had it, technically, in a savings account that I watched religiously, refreshing the balance on my phone like someone checking the weather. That money was supposed to be for new tires, unexpected medical bills, maybe one nice trip to the coast before my bones got too creaky for long drives. I wired them the money the next morning. The bank teller printed the confirmation slip, and I tucked it into a new folder, this one labeled Daniel and Megan. When the clinic sent an itemized statement, I added that too. Date, amount, payment method. I wrote it all down in my neat, round handwriting, the way my third-grade teacher had taught me. When Megan finally announced she was pregnant, it was via a carefully edited video on social media. There were balloons, soft music, and a slow-motion clip of Daniel kneeling to kiss her belly. My phone buzzed with notifications as cousins and neighbors tagged me in the comments, assuming I'd been there when they filmed it. I hadn't. I was in my kitchen, folding towels from the dryer, the hum of the machine my only background music. "Of course you'll throw the shower," my neighbor Lila said when I told her the news over coffee. "You're the grandma, that's how it works." I smiled and stirred too much sugar into my cup, feeling something inside me hesitate. A week later, I got a message from Megan. She had already booked the fellowship hall at the church and coordinated with her friend Jenna, who did event planning on the side. There was a link to an online registry, a carefully curated list of stroller brands, bottle warmers, and organic cotton onesies. At the bottom, in smaller text, there was a note: "Please avoid duplicates and contact Jenna with questions." There was no mention of me. I told myself not to be silly. They were young, modern. They did everything online. Still, I found my fingers tracing the edge of the screen, like I could smooth away the sting. Now, sitting in the car outside that same church, the gift bag crinkling under my hand, I watched as the other guests streamed in, each one greeted by Megan's bright smile. I had chosen a simple white blanket as my gift, soft as a cloud, and tucked the receipt into the tissue paper, just in case she wanted to exchange it for something more fashionable. The text message burned in my mind. "Just stay in the car, Mom." I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and closed my eyes. The air smelled faintly of the coffee I'd spilled in the cup holder last week, mixed with the floral scent of the hand lotion I kept in the glove compartment. Somewhere, a child laughed. The sound carried across the lot, bright and distant. I had stayed in so many places over the years. In the back row of school auditoriums, holding my breath as Daniel stood on stage. In hospital waiting rooms, counting the tiles on the floor while a surgeon spoke in another room. In my own small house on the edge of town, the light from the TV flickering across an empty couch. But as I straightened up and caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, a woman with tired eyes, lipstick carefully applied, hair set that morning with old pink rollers. I felt something shift. My hand went to my purse, fingers brushing the familiar edges of worn paper. Receipts, bank slips, the neat stack of documents I never left home without anymore. I thought of every check I'd written with their names on the memo line, every signature that tied my future to theirs, every promise they'd made. Casual and easy, as if words were as disposable as gift wrap. For the first time in a long while, I did not reach immediately for understanding or excuses or that old comforting phrase, "They don't mean anything by it." I sat there in the quiet of my aging sedan, the engine cooling with soft ticking sounds, and simply let myself feel the weight of what was happening. Outside, someone opened the fellowship hall doors, and a burst of laughter drifted toward me, along with the faint clatter of dishes being arranged on a buffet table. I could almost picture the inside: pastel decorations, a table piled with presents, a little chalkboard sign announcing "Welcome Baby Walker." I lifted my phone again, the screen waking up under my thumb. The message thread with Megan glowed at me, those last words hanging there, careless and sharp. Stay in the car. I didn't know it then, not fully, but that afternoon, in that parking lot, was the first time I began to understand that I had more power than they thought. Power tucked into folders and bank envelopes. Power in the simple act of deciding where I would and would not stay. I drove home with the radio off, my hands tight on the steering wheel. The blanket I'd meant to give them lay on the passenger seat, the soft corner of it brushing against my arm every time I made a turn. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was already lowering behind the maple trees, casting long shadows across the lawn I still mowed myself. I carried the gift inside, set it on the dining table, and stood there for a long moment, just listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. My house has always held a kind of gentle stillness, the kind that settles into the corners after years of routine. Frank built the kitchen cabinets with his own hands when Daniel was barely 2, and every time I open the drawer where I keep my dish towels, I can still hear the soft clatter of his tools on the counter. That night, though, even those reminders felt distant, like echoes from a life that belonged to someone else. I made myself tea, the same brand I've bought for 20 years, and sat at the small kitchen table worn smooth at the edges. There were days when Daniel used to do his homework here, pencil shavings scattered like confetti, and I'd sit across from him clipping coupons to stretch our grocery budget. Funny how the ordinary details of a life can become anchors, keeping you steady even when something inside you tilts. My phone buzzed once, a notification from Megan's social media story. I didn't open it. I put the phone face down on the table and watched the steam rise from my cup. The house creaked softly as it cooled from the afternoon heat. Outside, the street lights flickered on one by one. It wasn't the first time Megan had made me feel peripheral. That's the word I'd settled on. Not unwanted exactly, but shifted to the edge of things, like someone cropped out of a photograph. There had been little signs, quiet ones, times she'd forget to mention gatherings, moments when she'd speak for Daniel, answering questions meant for him. Even the way she'd correct me gently, with a smile too polished to feel natural. But I had always brushed those things aside. Told myself she was young, overwhelmed, adjusting. Told myself Daniel was busy, building a life. Told myself 1,000 tiny comforts that kept me from facing the truth. I had become convenient background to their story. 2 months before the shower, I remember stopping by their house with a bag of groceries. Nothing big, some soup, fruit, a rotisserie chicken from the store. I'd written a little note and clipped the receipt to the bag, out of habit more than anything. Megan answered the door, her phone still in her hand, screen glowing. She glanced at the bag and said, "Oh, thanks. You didn't have to do that." Her voice was polite, but distant, like she was already halfway back into whatever conversation she'd paused. I had stood there awkwardly, waiting for a moment of connection that never really came. When Daniel walked in from the garage, he hugged me quick, one arm around my shoulder, and said, "Love you, Mom." For a second, I felt warm again. But even then, Megan was already turning away, placing the groceries on the counter, her fingers tapping quickly over the screen as if checking boxes. Little moments, all of them small, yet they stayed with me, tucked into my thoughts the way I tucked receipts into folders. After finishing my tea, I walked to the hall closet. The light flickered on with that faint buzzing sound old bulbs make. There, on the second shelf, sat my folders, neatly labeled, carefully kept. The one marked Daniel and Megan was thicker than the others. I slid it out gently and flipped it open on the dining table. Inside were copies of the down payment transfer, the home inspection receipts I'd paid for when theirs suddenly wasn't in the budget, and the invoices from the fertility clinic. Lines of numbers stared up at me, steady and undeniable. Everything I had contributed was here, written in black ink, time-stamped, verified. Proof of every moment I had shown up. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger is loud and hot, and what I felt was quiet, heavy, like a stone placed in my hands. I closed the folder and rested my palms on it, feeling its weight. My reflection shifted faintly in the window across the room. A woman with soft gray hair, a tired but steady face. A grandmother-to-be who had been told to wait in the car. I inhaled slowly, letting the evening air settle around me. Something was changing, though I couldn't name it yet. There are moments in life when the ground doesn't shake, the sky doesn't split, but you know you've crossed into a different chapter simply because you feel different standing in your own kitchen. I sat there long after the tea went cold, the folder before me like a quiet reminder of what I had given and what I had allowed. Outside, a streetlight flickered, hesitated, then glowed steady again. So did I. I woke the next morning before the sun, the way I used to on workdays, when the house needed tending before anyone else stirred. The air was still cool, the kind that makes the floor cold beneath bare feet. I wrapped my old knit shawl around my shoulders and sat at the edge of my bed for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Sometimes the quiet is too honest. It tells you what you've avoided hearing. I made coffee and carried my mug to the kitchen window, watching the first stripe of light creep across the lawn. The events of the previous afternoon drifted back like a slow-moving tide. Megan's message, the laughter spilling from the fellowship hall, my reflection in the rearview mirror. I felt all of it again, not as sharply, but with a deeper ache, like a bruise just beneath the skin. I sat at the dining table again, the folder still where I'd left it. My fingertips traced the edge of the cover, feeling the faint ridges from years of filing and unfolding. People think paperwork is cold, impersonal, but I've always found it honest. A document doesn't pretend. A receipt doesn't soften the truth. They say exactly what happened, no more, no less. I opened the folder and pulled out the fertility clinic invoice. The numbers were so familiar now that I barely had to read them. I remembered standing at the bank counter, the sterile smell of ink and sanitizer, the teller tapping her keyboard while I pretended not to notice the pity in her smile. I remembered walking out with the confirmation slip in my purse and thinking, foolishly, that maybe this would bring us closer again. Have you ever felt something like this? that slow, dawning realization that love alone doesn't protect you from being taken for granted. I sat back in my chair and rubbed my temples. Megan hadn't always been this way. In the early years, she used to call me for recipes, for help with curtains, for advice on that dreadful tomato plant she insisted on saving. She would sit at my counter while I cooked and tell me about her classes, her hopes, her frustrations. I used to think we were building something like a second mother-daughter bond. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Maybe after they bought the house. Maybe after her mother moved away. Maybe when they realized how easily I said yes. There was one day I kept circling back to. The day Daniel and Megan had me sign a temporary guarantor form for a loan extension. Just a formality, Daniel had said, sliding the papers across their dining table. It was a neat stack, clipped together with bright yellow sticky notes Megan had placed marking where I needed to initial. She had smiled, brushing her hair back as she said, "It'll only be for a couple months. You always understand." I'd signed without question, without reading the fine print, though I always read the fine print. I had told myself it was for Daniel, but now, looking back, I wondered if they had expected that certainty from me, expected that blindness. My coffee had gone cold by the time I closed the folder again. I glanced around the room, this old house with its soft walls and worn floorboards. Every corner held a piece of me. Yet in my son's home, in their growing life, there was no place set aside for me. Not really, just vague promises and polite distance. I stood and walked to the living room, switching on the lamp beside the couch. I took a breath, steadying myself, and dialed Daniel's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice bright but rushed. "Hey, Mom, everything okay?" There it was again, that tone that suggested I called only when something was wrong. A part of me shrank at that, but I pressed on. "I wanted to ask how the shower went," I said. My voice came out softer than I intended. "Oh, it was great. Megan's friends went all out. She's exhausted today. Jenna took tons of pictures. We'll send you some." I waited, giving him room, but he didn't mention the text, didn't ask why I hadn't come in, didn't sound like someone who had even noticed. "I see," I murmured. "Did Megan mention anything to you?" There was a pause, the kind that reveals more than words. "About what?" I swallowed. "That she asked me to stay in the car." Silence again, a rustle of movement, as if he'd stepped into another room. When he spoke, his voice was lower, uncertain. "Mom, I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it. She's stressed. She wanted things to be perfect and maybe she got overwhelmed." The familiar explanation, the tidy excuse. I had used it myself 100 times. "But Daniel," I said gently, "it hurt." He exhaled, a weary sound. "I know. I'm sorry. I'll talk to her, okay? We just have a lot going on." In the background, I heard Megan's voice, muffled but sharp, asking who he was talking to. He answered her softly, too softly, and the conversation dissolved into whispers before he came back on the line. "Mom, I've got to go. Love you." The call ended before I could say it back. I lowered the phone slowly, my heart sinking. Something was deeply wrong, not just in how they treated me, but in how little they seemed to see it. I stood there for a long moment, the quiet settling heavy around me, and for the first time, I didn't swallow the hurt or fold it neatly into a pocket. I let myself feel it fully, knowing it was telling me the truth. Sometimes pain isn't a wound, sometimes it's a message, and I was finally ready to hear it. I didn't do much for the rest of the day, just drifted from room to room, straightening things that didn't need straightening. The house had that faint Sunday slow feeling, though it wasn't Sunday at all. Late afternoon sunlight crept across the living room carpet, warming the old fibers, making the dust in the air shimmer. I watched it the way you watch a memory, quietly, without touching it. By evening, I finally pulled myself together enough to cook a small dinner. Pasta with butter and peas, the kind of simple meal I made when money was tight and Daniel was little. I portioned half of it into a glass container and set it aside without thinking. It wasn't until I opened the refrigerator to place it in that I realized I had no reason to save leftovers for anyone else anymore. No one would be stopping by. No one would ask, "Did you make extra, Mom?" The container fogged with warmth as I let it sit on the counter. I ate alone at the kitchen table, the ticking of the clock filling the silence. After washing the dishes, I wandered into my bedroom. My dresser drawer stuck a little, the way it always had, and I gave it the same gentle nudge Frank used to give it. Inside, tucked beneath my winter sweaters, was a small wooden box. I hadn't opened it in years, but my hands knew exactly where it was. Inside were pieces of my life I didn't show anyone. Frank's watch, Daniel's first report card, a faded photograph of the three of us at the county fair. We were standing by the Ferris wheel, the sun behind us. Daniel had cotton candy stuck to his cheek. Frank had his arm around me. And I was younger, lighter, unafraid of taking up space in my own family. I held that photo for a long time. It wasn't the kind of sadness that brings tears. It was deeper than that, an ache that had settled quietly over the years, unnoticed because I'd grown used to carrying it. When I put the box away and closed the drawer, something in me shifted again, small but unmistakable. A little space in my chest cleared, like a window cracked open just enough to let in fresh air. The next morning, I drove to the grocery store, not because I needed much, but because I needed to be somewhere with people. The store was bright, overly air-conditioned, and playing soft instrumental music overhead. I walked slowly, looking at cereal boxes, comparing brands out of habit. Passing the bakery section, I saw a young couple choosing a cake. The woman held her belly with the same shy pride Megan had once shown. The man touched her shoulder gently as they talked about frosting. Something about the tenderness between them, the quiet way they included each other, hit me harder than I expected. I stepped away, pretending to study a display of canned soup, but the truth nudged at me again. I had poured so much into Daniel and Megan, yet somehow I had ended up on the outside looking in, like a stranger observing warmth through a window. On my way out, I stopped by the customer service desk. A young employee with braces smiled at me. "Need any help today?" I hesitated, then asked, "Where do you keep the personal file folders? The sturdier ones?" He pointed me to an aisle near the office supplies. I thanked him and walked toward it, my cart rattling slightly over a loose tile near the floral department. When I found the folders, I picked up a pack of thick, reinforced ones, navy blue. I don't know what made me choose that color. Maybe because it felt steady, serious. I placed the pack in my cart and drove home without turning on the radio. Back at the house, I opened the navy folder and placed it beside the old one labeled Daniel and Megan. For a moment, I didn't know what to call the new one. It wasn't meant for bills or receipts. It wasn't meant to document what I gave. It was meant to hold something I had neglected for years, my boundaries, my proof of self-respect. I didn't label it yet, but I knew I would. Later that afternoon, I heard a knock on the door. My heart jumped before my mind caught up. It wasn't Daniel's knock. His was always rushed, like he was already headed somewhere else. This knock was slow, deliberate. When I opened the door, it was my neighbor, Lila. She held a tin of lemon bars wrapped in foil. "I made too many," she said, though we both knew she made exactly enough. "Thought you might want company." We sat on my porch, eating lemon bars and watching cars glide past. The breeze carried the faint scent of cut grass from somewhere down the street. After a while, she glanced over at me gently. "You seem quiet today," she said. I didn't know where to begin, so I told her the simplest truth. I think I've let people treat me smaller than I am. Lila nodded, not pressing, just listening in that patient way she has. Happens to the best of us, she said. But it doesn't have to stay that way. Her words settled into me, steadier than any comfort I'd offered myself. As the sun began to set, I walked back inside, feeling something unfamiliar, but grounding, a sense of direction, not a plan yet, not a solution, but the early shape of one, a clarity that came not from anger, but from understanding my own worth. And as I closed the door behind me, I wondered quietly, when did I forget I deserved to be treated better than an afterthought? That night, sleep came in shallow waves. I kept waking to the soft glow of the street lamp outside my window, the kind that always reminded me of late shifts at the hospital, when the world felt both too big and too quiet. Around 3 a.m, I gave up and went to the kitchen, letting the cool linoleum ground me. I poured myself a glass of water and traced the rim with my thumb, feeling the condensation gather. My mind wandered back to the way Daniel's voice had tightened on the phone, the way he'd whispered to Megan before returning with that tired, practiced apology. I had heard that tone before, years ago when he was a boy, caught between telling the truth and protecting someone he loved. This time, though, he hadn't been protecting me. The next day, I decided to busy myself with small tasks. I cleaned the living room, dusting the mantel where Frank's picture still sat in its sturdy wooden frame. His smile always steadied me, even now. I stepped back, adjusting the angle of the frame until it caught the light just right. By mid-morning, I felt restless. A quiet kind of determination had begun forming inside me. Not fiery, not impulsive, just deliberate. I walked to the hall closet again and opened the folder. I looked at the mortgage assistance receipts, the notarized papers from the loan extension, the bank transfer confirmations. Each document was a moment in time where I had said yes, where I had trusted that love was enough to hold us all in place. But documents don't lie, and they don't forget. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Mom, can we swing by later? Megan wants to drop off your plate from the shower." My plate, as if that were the part I missed. I typed back, "I'll be home." When they arrived, I saw them pull into the driveway through the front window. Daniel stepped out first, carrying a plastic container wrapped in foil. Megan stayed in the car, tapping her phone with sharp little motions. I watched for a moment before opening the door. Daniel handed me the container with a bright but strained smile. "They saved you some food," he said. "It was a really nice shower. Lots of people." "I'm sure," I answered softly. He shifted, glancing back at the car. "Megan's tired today. She didn't sleep well." The silence stretched between us, thin as a thread. I nodded toward the driveway. "You two can come in, if you'd like." His hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough. "Maybe another time. We've got errands." Of course they did. Before he could turn back to the car, I said, "Daniel, I need to talk to you soon. Really talk." That stopped him. He looked at me with a flicker of worry. Real worry this time. "Is everything okay?" "I'm not sure," I said. "But I think it's time we sort a few things out. Just you and me." He rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit he inherited from Frank. Yeah, okay, we can do that." Megan honked, lightly but impatiently. Daniel squeezed my hand in a rushed gesture and jogged back to the car. As they drove away, I stood on my porch, feeling the faint vibration of the passing tires under my feet. The house behind me felt unusually still. Inside, I set the container on the counter. I didn't open it. Instead, I went to my desk and pulled out a small stack of printer paper. I began listing the dates of every financial contribution I could recall. Down payments, bills, clinic fees. even the small things like groceries and repairs. Not for confrontation. Not yet. But because I needed clarity for myself. The more I wrote, the steadier my hand became. Later in the afternoon, I decided to take a short walk. The air had that gentle spring warmth that invites you outside whether you intend to go or not. I walked down the familiar sidewalk, waving at Mrs. Howard as she watered her azaleas. The neighborhood smelled of fresh mulch and laundry detergent carried on the breeze. As I reached the park, I sat on a bench beneath an old oak tree, its branches swaying lazily overhead. A couple sat on a blanket nearby, their heads bent together over a tiny pair of baby shoes. I found myself watching them longer than intended. They weren't perfect, no couple is, but there was something about the way they paid attention to each other that tugged at me. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the sunlight warm my face. Somewhere deep inside, a truth rose to the surface, clear and quiet. I had been giving without asking anything in return. Not gratitude, not respect, not even honesty. And people who are used to endless giving rarely stop to wonder whether the well has a bottom. As I walked back home, the thought followed me like a shadow. Steady, unmistakable. I wasn't angry, not yet. But I was awake, and once you wake up, you can't go back to sleep just because someone else finds your silence convenient. The following morning, I woke with a surprising sense of steadiness, as if the night had quietly rearranged something inside me while I slept. I moved slowly through the house, opening blinds one by one. The light felt softer than usual, like it was giving me space to ease into the day. I made oatmeal, stirring it with the same wooden spoon I'd used since Daniel was a toddler. The rhythmic motion soothed me. When I carried my bowl to the kitchen table, the sight of the two folders, old and new, waiting there didn't frighten me the way it once might have. Instead, they felt like companions, witnesses, evidence that I hadn't imagined the sacrifices I'd made, that my memory wasn't exaggerating anything. After breakfast, I called the bank. Not for a withdrawal, not for another transfer, but for information. I spoke with a representative named Ellen, a woman about my age with a voice as warm as a sweater fresh from the dryer. She helped me review the guarantor paperwork I had signed months earlier. She explained each clause simply, without judgment, and confirmed something I had quietly suspected. My signature wasn't a formality. If Daniel and Megan defaulted on that loan extension, the liability would come to me, fully, immediately, and without question. When I hung up, I sat very still. The kitchen clock ticked in the background, each sound landing like a soft reminder. Had I really been that easy to sway? Have you ever realized too late that you had trusted someone with a part of your life they didn't know how to handle carefully? I didn't cry. I just let the truth settle. Later, I drove to the library. The building smelled like sun-warmed carpet and old paper, and the quiet there didn't hurt the way silence at home sometimes did. I found a corner table near the window and spread out copies of the financial documents I'd brought with me. As I reviewed each page, I wrote notes in the margins, dates, amounts, where conversations had taken place, the exact wording I remembered, not out of spite, but for clarity, for grounding, for the simple dignity of knowing my own narrative. While I was writing, I noticed an elderly man at the next table struggling with the copier machine. His papers kept feeding crooked, causing a jam. I stood, walked over, and showed him how to align the edges properly. He laughed, embarrassed, and thanked me. "Machines never listen to me," he said. I smiled. "People don't always listen either." He chuckled softly. "Well, that I believe." The moment was small, but it reminded me of something important. When people do appreciate you, you feel it, without effort, without guessing. On my way home, I stopped by the post office to pick up a certified letter I had been notified about. My heart fluttered. imagining all the worst possibilities. But when the clerk handed it to me, I recognized the sender immediately. It was from the fertility clinic. Inside was a notice of remaining balance, one I had never seen before. The enclosed itemized sheet listed the payment I had made months earlier, but it also showed new charges added afterward in Daniel and Megan's names, with a note indicating that my earlier payment had been misclassified under a guarantor code, not a gift. That meant the clinic believed I was financially responsible for subsequent charges unless the primary patients updated their file. My hands trembled, but not from fear, more from a slow, cold kind of realization. When I got home, I laid the notice on the dining table beside the folders. Then I sat, folded my hands, and let the pieces of the past year arrange themselves in a way I had refused to see before. Megan had wanted my help, but only quietly, only conveniently, only behind the scenes. She had wanted my money, but not my presence. My son, my sweet boy, had become so entangled in her world that he couldn't see the way I was being edged out of it. And I, God help me, had allowed it because I believed this was what loving your family looked like. Have you ever watched yourself disappear from someone's life one unchallenged decision at a time? The house was dim by the time I stirred. I turned on a lamp and pulled a small notebook toward me. For the first time, I began outlining what I needed, not for revenge, not yet for justice, but for self-protection. I wrote down what boundaries I had silently neglected. I wrote what I could no longer offer. I wrote what I expected from them if our relationship was to heal. Halfway through writing, a strange feeling came over me. Strength, but a quiet version, the kind that grows from truth rather than anger. As I closed the notebook, I heard myself whisper into the room, "I won't be invisible anymore." And for the first time in years, the words didn't feel like wishful thinking. They felt like a decision. The next few days passed with a calm that almost felt borrowed, as if it didn't quite belong to me yet. Still, I welcomed it. I kept myself moving, small chores, a walk to the mailbox, a batch of blueberry muffins I ended up freezing because I didn't feel much like eating them. I wasn't avoiding anything. I was simply gathering myself. On Thursday morning, I received a voicemail from Daniel. His tone was breezy, almost practiced. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. We're thinking of repainting the nursery. Well, Megan is, and I might need your truck next week. Call me back when you can." Not a word about the clinic notice. Not a word about the way Megan had treated me at the shower. Not a word about the conversation I had asked for. It wasn't malicious. I knew that. It was something else. Something quieter, rooted in years of me stepping aside without asking anyone to notice. I deleted the message, not out of spite, but because there was nothing there I needed to keep. Around noon, I drove to the clinic. I didn't tell Daniel or Megan. I didn't even tell Lila, though she'd offered more than once to come with me to any errand that feels heavier than it should. The clinic's waiting room was cool and smelled faintly of lavender, the artificial kind pumped through vents to make anxious people feel calm. A receptionist with a kind face and efficient fingers typed my name into her computer. After a moment, she looked up with polite confusion. "Are you the primary or secondary contact on the Walker account?" "Neither," I said. "I was a contributor for one of their bills. I'm here to straighten out a notice I received." She led me to a small side office where a financial counselor met with me. The counselor, a man in his 40s with reading glasses perched low on his nose, reviewed the file carefully. His professionalism steadied me. He tapped one line on his screen. "It looks like the previous payment you made was entered incorrectly. Because of that, the system marked you as an active financial guarantor. We'll correct the coding today." "And the new charges?" I asked. "Those belong solely to the patients, not you." I exhaled, my shoulders loosening a little. He printed a confirmation letter, signed it, and handed it to me. Keep this for your records, and if you receive anything else incorrectly, call me directly. I folded the document into my purse, feeling the faint thrill of reclaiming something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Control. As I walked back through the waiting room, I passed a young woman sitting alone, twisting the strap of her purse around her fingers. Her face held the same anxious hope I had seen on Megan years earlier. For a moment, I paused, letting compassion wash over whatever resentment lingered. Life is complicated. People are complicated. But fairness is simple. Outside, the sky was bright with early spring. I stood near my car, letting the breeze cool my cheeks. I wasn't taking anything from Daniel or Megan. I wasn't working against them. I was simply stepping out of a place I never should have been put into. When I got home, I added the confirmation letter to the new Navy folder. I still hadn't labeled it, but its purpose was becoming clearer with each passing day. A few hours later, my phone buzzed, a text from Megan. "Hey, I heard from Daniel. You've been stressed. Everything okay?" Stressed. Not hurt, not dismissed, not excluded. Stressed. Her words skimmed across the surface of what mattered, never touching the deeper truth. And the most striking part was realizing she probably didn't even know how to reach deeper. She had never needed to. I typed a simple reply. "We need to talk soon. There are some important things to clear up." She didn't answer right away. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, "Okay, after the weekend?" It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an acknowledgement. But it was a step, and I would decide how large or small that step was allowed to be. That evening, I baked a loaf of banana bread. The house filled with the warm, familiar scent, wrapping around me like an old friend. As I sliced the bread, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, an assurance that my life, my home, my choices had weight outside of anyone else's needs. After dinner, I sat in the living room with the lamp on and the windows cracked open. A soft breeze rustled the curtains. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked and children laughed as they rode bicycles past my yard. Life went on, gentle and unhurried. I leaned back on the couch and closed my eyes. I realized then that this wasn't the beginning of revenge at all. It was the beginning of reclaiming my place in my own story, and for the first time in a very long while, that felt enough. The weekend arrived with a soft drizzle, the kind that makes the world feel wrapped in thin, gray cotton. I didn't mind it. Drizzly days have always steadied me. They slow everything down just enough for thoughts to catch up with feelings. I spent most of Saturday in quiet motion, folding laundry, wiping the kitchen counters, reorganizing a drawer of mismatched Tupperware lids. Little things, but they made the house feel warm, cared for. By Sunday morning, the clouds finally began to thin. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the neighborhood come back to life. Kids splashed in leftover puddles. The mailman walked his route with a practiced rhythm. Even the breeze seemed lighter. Behind all of it, I felt a gentle weight gathering in my chest. Not dread exactly, but a readiness, a certainty that the conversation with Daniel and Megan was approaching, whether or not they realized how much needed to be said. Late that afternoon, my phone rang. "Daniel." "Mom, hey," he said. "We're free tomorrow evening if you want to talk." Tomorrow, not today, not now. Tomorrow, when it fit neatly into their schedule. "Well," I answered, "tomorrow works." His relief was instant. "Great, we'll come by after dinner." After we hung up, I looked around the living room. The quiet didn't feel heavy the way it once had. It felt expectant, like a room waiting for light to reach it. The next day, I decided to prepare, not with rehearsed speeches or tidy statements, but with clarity. I pulled the navy folder from the dining table drawer and reviewed everything I had placed inside. The clinic correction letter, my notes, the timeline of contributions, the boundaries I'd written in that small notebook. None of it was ammunition. It was simply the truth arranged neatly, patiently. As evening approached, I lit a lamp in the living room and cracked open a window to let in the cool air. I wanted the room to feel calm, neutral ground. When their car pulled up, I recognized the sound immediately. Megan's SUV, the engine humming with that quiet purr newer cars always have. They stepped onto the porch together. Daniel looked uneasy, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. Megan stood slightly behind him, her expression polite but tight, as if bracing for criticism she was already prepared to reinterpret. "Come in," I said gently. They followed me to the living room. Daniel sat first, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Megan perched lightly on the edge of the couch, smiling thinly, her phone peeking from her purse like an escape hatch. I took my seat across from them and let a moment of silence settle. Not punitive, just intentional. "I'm glad you're both here," I began. "There are a few things I need to talk about. Not out of anger, but out of necessity." Daniel nodded quickly. "Okay, we're here to listen." But he didn't look at me. Not fully. I turned to Megan. "I want to start with the baby shower." Her shoulders tensed. "I figured that's why you were upset," she said. "It wasn't personal. There were just a lot of people, and I didn't want things to feel awkward." "Awkward for whom?" I asked softly. She blinked, thrown for a moment. "I just meant, I didn't want you to feel out of place." Out of place. The phrase hung there, a thin thread of truth she hadn't intended to reveal. I folded my hands. "Megan, you texted me while I was sitting outside the church. You asked me to stay in the car." Color rose in her cheeks. Not shame exactly, but discomfort. It was chaotic inside. I wasn't thinking clearly. I'm pregnant, everything's emotional, and sometimes this isn't about emotion, I said, still gentle. It's about respect. Daniel lifted his head then, worry flickering in his eyes. "Mom, she didn't mean anything by it." "I know," I replied, "but it still meant something." The room quieted around that truth. I let it sit, the way you let a wound breathe before covering it properly. Then I reached for the navy folder, not to open it, but to place it beside me, visible. "There's something else we need to discuss," I continued. "The loan extension I signed, and the fertility clinic charges." Daniel stiffened immediately. Megan's lips parted, but no words came out. "I spoke with the bank," I said, "and the clinic." Daniel leaned back slowly. "Mom, you didn't have to do that." "I needed clarity," I replied. "And now I have it." Megan finally found her voice. "We were going to fix it. We just hadn't yet." "It wasn't your responsibility," I said, looking at her steadily. "It was mine, because I signed without asking the right questions, and that won't happen again." The calm in my voice seemed to unsettle them more than anger ever could. Daniel rubbed his temples. "Mom, we're not trying to take advantage of you." "I believe that," I said. "But intention doesn't erase impact." Silence again, this time heavier but necessary. "I love you both," I continued, "and I want to be part of your lives. But not like this, not as someone you lean on but don't look at, not as someone who gives but isn't invited inside." Megan swallowed hard. "We didn't realize." "I know," I said softly. "That's the problem." Daniel's voice broke a little. "Mom, we're sorry." I nodded, not accepting, not rejecting, just acknowledging. "This isn't about punishment," I said. "It's about making sure we move forward in a way that's fair. For all of us." Megan's eyes glistened, though she blinked the emotion away quickly. Daniel looked down at his hands, quiet. For the first time in a long time, I felt the ground beneath my feet. Not shaky, not uncertain, but steady. I wasn't finished. But they had heard me, and that was the first true shift. They left that night more quietly than they had arrived. Daniel hugged me at the door, longer than usual, his hand trembling just slightly between my shoulder blades. Megan offered a soft goodbye, her voice thinner than her usual confident tone. When their car finally backed out of the driveway, the taillights glowing like two small embers fading into the night, I stood on the porch for a while, feeling the cool air settle around me. Inside, the house felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, as though the walls themselves had heard the truth spoken out loud and were adjusting to it. I walked slowly through each room, touching familiar things: the ceramic bowl Frank once used for his keys, the lace doily my mother crocheted decades ago, the armchair where I'd rocked Daniel through fevers and bad dreams. These objects had been my witnesses long before the folders, long before the documents. They had held the silence of all the things I had not said. Now that silence was changing. The next morning, I woke early, almost energized. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sat by the window with my notebook. Not the folder this time, just the notebook. For the first time in years, I wrote about myself, what I needed, what I hoped for, what I wanted that had nothing to do with being someone's mother or someone's helper. The words came slowly, like shy guests arriving one at a time, but they came. Later, my neighbor Lila stopped by with a basket of tomatoes from her garden. "You've got a glow about you today," she said, handing me the basket. "Either you had a great night's sleep, or you finally told someone the truth they needed to hear." I laughed softly. Maybe a little of both. We sat on my porch again, just like before, but this time she didn't press with questions. She simply listened as I said, "I think I'm starting to find myself again." She squeezed my hand. "It's about time." After she left, I decided to take a small trip into town. Nothing dramatic, just an errand run. I stopped at the post office, the dry cleaner, and finally the hardware store. I wandered the aisles, letting my fingers drift over paint swatches and drawer knobs, imagining small changes I could make around the house. Not because anything needed fixing, but because I wanted to choose things for myself again. While I was comparing paint colors, a soft sage green caught my eye. I heard someone say my name. "Irene, is that you?" I turned to see Officer Reed, a familiar face from years back when he used to patrol our neighborhood. He was older now, grayer at the temples, but still carried that calm authority people instinctively trusted. "Hello, officer," I said, smiling. "It's been a while." He asked how I'd been, and for once I didn't give the easy answer. I told him things had been complicated lately, not in dramatic detail, just enough to be honest. He nodded thoughtfully. "Complicated is when people start forgetting their responsibilities. Happens more than you'd think." There was a weight to his words, a quiet reassurance. I found myself thanking him without fully knowing why. Maybe because his presence reminded me I had every right to stand on solid ground, every right to assert myself without apology. When I returned home, I found a text from Daniel waiting on my phone. "Mom, thanks for talking with us yesterday. Megan and we didn't realize how things looked from your side. We're thinking about everything you said." A second message followed. "Can we meet again soon? Just us. I want to understand better." I sat down slowly on the couch, absorbing the words. They weren't perfect. They weren't a full apology, but they were real. And they were his, my son's words, not filtered, not prompted, not whispered through someone else's expectations. I typed back, "Yes, I'd like that." Just 6 words, but they felt like a door gently opening. That evening, I made soup, not out of obligation, but because I wanted the comfort of a warm bowl in my hands. I ladled myself a portion and sat at the dining table. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful, like something inside me had finally stopped clinging to what used to be and had begun reaching for what could come next. After dinner, I pulled out the Navy folder once more. I reviewed the documents, but not with the same protective urgency. This time, I looked at them with clarity. These papers were no longer about proving my worth to anyone. They were about understanding the boundaries of my own future. I slid the folder back into the drawer and closed it gently. As I turned off the dining room light, I paused for a moment, letting the dim glow from the hallway guide me. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. An older woman, yes, but steady, present, no longer blurred at the edges. In the quiet of that room, I whispered something I hadn't dared to say in years. I deserve a life that includes me. And the stillness around me, warm and unhurried, felt like agreement. The next week unfolded with a gentle rhythm I hadn't felt in years. I woke early, opened the windows to let in the soft spring air, and moved through the house with a quiet certainty. Like each room was rediscovering me as much as I was rediscovering it. I watered the plants on the windowsill, wiped down the kitchen counters, and even rearranged the living room furniture just slightly, enough to make the space feel refreshed. On Wednesday morning, Daniel called. "Mom," he said, his voice steadier this time. "Can I come by after work? Just me." Something inside me warmed at that, an echo of the boy who used to run into the house shouting my name after school. "Of course," I said. When he arrived, he looked tired in the way new parents often do before the Solby is even born, carrying a mix of anticipation, fear, and responsibility that hasn't quite found its balance yet. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same spot where he did his homework as a child. For a moment, he just looked around the room, his eyes softening. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, "about everything you said." I nodded, giving him space. "I never meant to make you feel pushed aside," he said. "I guess I got caught up in life, and I didn't notice how much you were carrying for all of us." His voice cracked slightly, and I felt something loosen inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. He wasn't a boy anymore, but he wasn't heartless either. He was just learning the way we all learn, through mistakes we didn't see ourselves making. "I know you didn't mean it," I said gently, "but it still hurt, and I needed you to hear that." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I did, and I do, and I promise I want to do better, for you, for the baby, for all of us." It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a movie script apology, but it was honest, and his eyes finally met mine without hesitation. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. His fingers tightened around mine the way they used to when he was small and frightened. We talked for a long while after that. Not about money, not about documents or boundaries. Just about life. About Frank, about childhood memories he thought I'd forgotten, about the kind of father he hoped to be. When he finally stood to leave, he hugged me with a warmth I hadn't felt from him in years. As I watched him walk to his car, I felt a deep, quiet peace settle in my chest. Not everything was fixed. Not everything would be easy. But something fundamental had shifted. Something that made room for a new beginning. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. A soft breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and early blossoms. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like a place I was being pushed out of. It felt like a place I was choosing to walk into. The Navy folder was still in the drawer, but it no longer felt like armor. It felt like a reminder, a quiet promise to myself that my life had value, structure, and a voice that would no longer go unheard. My world was expanding again, not shrinking. A neighbor walked by and waved. I waved back. The sky deepened into twilight, and I breathed in the soft, warm air. I realized then that the real victory wasn't about exposing wrongs or gathering proof. It wasn't even about being right. It was about being whole again, being present in my own life, being someone who didn't need permission to exist. And as I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the neighborhood settle around me, a gentle truth rose inside me like a quiet sunrise. Sometimes the strongest form of retribution is simply reclaiming yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, I'd be grateful if you liked and subscribed. Your support means more than you know. And tell me, if you were in my place, what would you have done?